noticed, this is Barry White, your host. I'm a little under the weather this week, so this will mostly be Rob's ramblings or Bobby's bemusements. I don't know, whatever we want to call it. So hopefully Rob will do a majority of the talking, although I can usually have a hard time keeping my trap shut. But anyway, I am not Barry White. I am Justin Julander, and I'm your host with Rob Stone. So yeah, and it's time for another clip show. So I'm always reminded of that Simpsons episode where they did the clip show and they said,
sorry for the clip show. Never fear, we'll have stories for years.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's always going through my head when we do these. But I don't know. It's kind of an interesting or a nice way to kind of review what we talked about, have, some insights, especially since that was back in the Chuck days. And so Rob probably was yelling at his phone some comments and while we were doing the shows possibly. So give him a chance to express his ideas on some of these topics. So, well, without further ado, I think we should dive in. What
Awesome.
do you think? All right. So episode 51 or show 51, whatever you want to call them. We talked about caging. So building your own versus buying caging, basically. So that was me and Chuck debating that. We introduced our first sponsor, Welch's Fruit Chews. I think Chuck had a mouthful of Welch's Fruit Chews and he was not speaking well. So I had to laugh about that. But
yeah, a little extra vocal texture for the show. Always good.
Yeah.
Sometimes appreciated. Always good.
Yeah, right. We had to bring back some sponsors. It's nice having sponsors. And Welch's, I mean, they were a great sponsor. They really
Absolutely.
gave us all the fruit chews we could chew.
Absolutely.
Well, what are your thoughts on caging?
Well, I think my own lack of proficiency dictates me to be best situated in a purchase spot. I do, man, you see Keith's stuff where he's made that himself. It's truly incredible. And it's obviously, you can customize it to your space. It's held up incredibly well for a long time. It's suited to his needs in his space. And I do think there's a ton of beauty to that. Obviously, the contrary side is if you're like me, where that's not necessarily your wheelhouse or where you're best situated, it's probably going to be something where you either, and maybe the answer is that I could do it to a functional level, but I want it to look really good, and I probably don't have the capacity to build it that way. And so it's probably inevitably going to lead to disappointment if I do it myself. So that's probably where I'm at from my own personal perspective. At the same time, I know there are people out there who are situated to do it well and who do it amazingly. Mm-hmm. So as with most of these topics, people would be dissatisfied that I'm insufficiently fighting because I see a clear benefit to either side. It's really about the keeper and their own time and capacity.
Yeah. And also depending on what species you're keeping, I'm sure the cages you buy are probably geared more towards what you're keeping in them rather than what's cheaper or what's, that kind of thing.
Yeah, for sure. Right. And obviously if you're going to do like some sort of pressed wood that you're sealing or whatever, that's probably not going to be best situated to use that for Shinosaurus or some, semi-aquatic to aquatic creature. That probably doesn't make sense. So, there's got to be alignment on that sort of stuff between the materials that you're either that are utilized in a purchased enclosure or that you're utilizing yourself. Some of that is resource availability, right? I think I remember from the show, even a big part of the conversation was the uptick in price on the raw materials. So that maybe some of the savings that people often attribute for making their own, I wouldn't pitch savings at this point. I think it's more about like, okay, you're customizing it to your space. And if you're really skilled, then you might have the capacity to make something that even exceeds what you can purchase at that same price point. But it's not like, the old, how it used to be framed in the old days. Oh, you could make 4 of them for the price of one, purchase one, something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think prices have kind of come down to a little more normalistic level. I mean, those ridiculous prices during the pandemic, and this show was back in 2022. So we're a little bit behind in the clip shows. I apologize for that, but there was just that enormous price gouging that was going on just because, production stopped. And so the demand was high, but the availability was low. So I think it was kind of about the worst time to be building cages, but I think it's come back down a little bit to more reasonable levels. I mean, for example, like a sheet of chipboard, just kind of the stuff that you frame a house with or whatever, was like $15 back in the day, at least at my Home Depot. And then it went up to $50 a sheet. And then it's back down to like 20 or $25 a sheet. So, it's back to close to what it was before, but not quite as far down as it was. So, yeah, but I don't know. I think the biggest thing for me, especially now, since I'm trying to get more larger caging in my room, I bought a bunch of shipping crates thinking I would convert those into cages. And it takes so long to do one. And I was hoping to kind of, get going and have kind of like a production line or something, and just knock out a bunch of them at a time. Just hasn't worked out. And they're just sitting, taking up room in my garage now. It's like, now what am I going to do with these shipping crates that I spent $1,000 on? So I've resorted to buying caging and then kind of, I guess adding things, like fake rock work or hide boxes or something like that would match the natural history. So right now I'm getting a couple for womas. I'm trying to, improve their caging, and I'm building like some fake termite mounds that are like an entrance into a hide box that has like a pipe that will have kind of a humid microenvironment. So little adding these things after the cage build is kind of the goal now, I guess. But yeah, it's a little hard to pay for caging, I think, and I do like to build, but anyway, that's kind of my musings as of late.
Yeah, certainly the benefits to, and I don't think this will be a topic within the 50 episodes 51 to 60, but certainly a benefit to keeping smaller stuff is the price point on just, maybe that's one of the things that's so amazing, right? Is how much the price escalates just being a foot longer or whatever, right? Yeah. So it's not just, it's the same as 1.5 of these. It's like, no, it's not reflected in the price associated with that. Instead it's going to be double or whatever. So it's kind of wild that way.
For sure. Yeah. I always thought it was, I look at cage builds and I think, now, why did they do that? That seems like very wasteful way to do it. Or, it seems like that would make it cost a lot more. The animal plastics, or the ones that have kind of the round frame around the front, where they just took a piece of, PVC and then just cut out a hole. And that's where the doors, slide in and out of or whatever. But I mean, it's kind of a nice design because it prevents the animals from being able to push the edge of the door. If there's any kind of gap, they can't get their head in there because there's, too small of a gap. But I'm thinking, man, that's a lot of waste. They probably could have done that in a different way and had the same result, just a lot less expensive. But that's just, it's probably easier to route out a hole than to try to join, 4 pieces of strips together to do the same thing. So I don't know. I guess some things are probably from a more, rapid build or a more structurally sound build. Yeah. Yeah,
for sure. I wonder, are you thinking of the bubble file ones when you mentioned?
Yeah, that might be it. Well, I can't remember.
I bought them
used from Chuck, so I don't remember what I thought it was animal plastics, but I could be wrong. Yeah.
I think that's mostly what he had. So I suppose so. Maybe I'm just not visualizing it right, but because they kind of have that same, and it used to be a square, and then at some point it actually became rounded or whatever. So I think I'm trying to visualize it even in my mind now. But yeah, super interesting. As you say, it's kind of even within the manufactured stuff, there's a ton of variability with different features that people either like or don't, right? There are pluses and minuses to having a singular piece that kind of folds down versus pieces of plexi that'll interact with one another.
For sure. Yep. Yeah.
Is there a litter dam? How big is it? All this stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. So. Yep. I've been buying a few of those dubia roachdubia.com caging that you kind of assemble yourself and they ship flat. And I've been pretty happy with them for the most part. I mean, Utah's not the best for screen tops, but you can kind of stack them together and that, eliminates that. And I can screw in a light, fixture to the top of the cage and mount that there and stuff. So it works out okay. And I've been doing a few of those and, putting in some additions to them to make them a little more sound and usable in Utah. But yeah, those have been reasonable. They're fairly reasonably priced and I feel like I'm building them.
Right. At least you get the assembly aspect.
Exactly. Yeah. But, yeah. So I don't know. Caging is always kind of that, that thing that I think herpers kind of have, well, at least over the last couple decades, we've kind of thought, oh, it's, rack system. That's what we want to do. That's the answer, because then we can keep 1 million snakes in a tiny space and we can produce, we can be like Brian Barczyk or, some of these big producers that breed a lot of stuff. So that was kind of my mindset a little bit earlier on, thinking, oh, how cool would that be to have just so many snakes and, walls of caging. And I think, we were kind of sold that bill of goods a little bit. And I'm glad to see we're moving out of that and moving into larger caging and things like that. And then the fact that you don't get to see them, in a rack system, you're not enjoying the animals you're keeping. It's just kind of like a farm more so than a cool animal that you get to watch and experience.
Yeah, exactly right. I had the same sort of experience growing in the hobby. So kind of with that being an ideal, right?
Yeah.
And as you highlight, right, then the enjoyment became in the production, in the sale, and all this stuff. And it's like, well, those are no longer my focus points. And so, I want to be able to sit there and enjoy them and not have to open it up to see it for a second before, if we're talking about mountain king snakes or something, they just shoot to the back and it's like, wow, okay.
Exactly. All right. Anything else to add on that one?
No, I think that's really good. We, as with all of these things, I do think it'll be interesting maybe if we have additional guests come on to talk through it differently, or even things that just change, right? As you highlighted, right? Resource availability, price structure, different, even amongst manufacturers, maybe different things come onto or off of the market. I mentioned Boafile earlier, and he's still breeding boas, but he's not making cages anymore. Changed his life around and doing all this different stuff. So that was something that was around from well before me. And, I've had several iterations of those cages, and then I just went onto the website one day and it was like, oh yeah, he's not making them anymore. So that's not we do see that with new, and certainly, right, there are a bunch of new manufacturers sort of constantly, and I guess it's not that unusual that there would be, for all those new people, there's probably to satiate that or to create that demand that they're trying to satisfy, right? There are people falling off as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wonder if Jeff might want to come on and chat about that. That'd be really enlightening to hear his experience with cage building versus breeding animals, and could kind of fit in that category of, what's a better business model, the animals or
right?
The support, like we just had few episodes ago, or maybe it's been a little longer than that.
Right.
Cool.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good idea. Let me write that down while we're there.
Sounds good.
But yeah, I think otherwise we're good to get to the next one in line.
Okay. The next show we talked to Ben Morrill, had him on. Excuse me. And we were talking about influencers in the animal industry. And I think this coincided, I know this coincided with the Animal Con, the Animal Conference, where all the animal-based influencers or YouTube stars kind of got together. And I was surprised. We were visiting Bob Ashley's place on one of our herp trips to Arizona, the Arizona New Mexico border, and stopped by Bob's place, and he mentioned something about how he was busy with that. And I'm like, oh, that's your show. I was a little surprised that he was involved in that. Sorry, I just sucked in a fly. Oh God, that was fun. Anyway, so we were talking about kind of if influencers were good or bad for the hobby in general. And so what's your take, Rob?
Well, that was pretty interesting. This is almost like a notes from the field there. If you're just gonna suck in flies, They anyway.
Good stuff.
Yeah, I don't know. That was certainly an interesting episode. It was surprising. Just obviously, Ben so well, and he always has a ton of interesting stuff to say. And maybe he usually gets pigeonholed into specific things based on all his expertise and all that. But yeah, so I did think that was a super interesting show. But yeah, maybe not what I would have intuitively expected. I think generally speaking, well, I don't know, right? I thought of it in the context today, and maybe this was alluded to in one of the various, Facebook Messenger groups that we're a part of or whatever previously, but I didn't have the context to know about it. I saw that an influencer, so to speak, now that I think people in Florida, our Florida buddies actually know, was what looked like a broad-banded copperhead. So I assume he's in West Texas. He got bit by a small one, and then just was like, the Lord is with me. I'll just keep herping and it'll be fine. And then he made a video where he's holding one on its way. It's like, I don't know. I do think putting positive content into the world, that animal influencers can do good things. I do think to the extent that social media platforms incentivize negative behavior or engaging in problematic, risky behavior and this sort of stuff, I do think it's dangerous, and heck, I mean, we always go back even to the question with Steve Irwin and stuff of like, authenticity to some of that filming, right? Oh, we just happened to come across this clutch of, I don't remember if it was
green tree pythons or
was it green tree? Yeah. Some, where it's just like, oh, and they happen to be hatching on this day. And it's like, well,
and they're all spread out along a branch of a palm frond or something. You're like, yeah, that seems legit.
Right. And maybe, the answer was, oh, we did actually find him a month ago. And then we'd have been, watching him, over this course of time or whatever, I'm not, and that's certainly the visualization on that is amazing. Yeah. Right. It's just, the question for me is always, do you need to be dishonest about the context to have it be equally amazing? And I would generally say, to me as an audience member, the answer to that would be no. But that might not be right relative to sort of the social media demands, right? Or what gets highlighted and this sort of thing. If it does have that context of, well, it's just the 1 in a million, 1 in 10 million, whatever it is, occurrence, as opposed to being, well, yeah, it was a really fortunate, a lot of hard work, really fortunate. And then even just the diligence of, hey, we came back every day to check in on these. And then it happened to be today that we could start filming and have this beautiful visualization that maybe we sweetened a little bit too by, let's spread out a little bit. This one isn't quite sitting right or whatever. Right. In some ways, I really appreciate that work and hearing of the work that goes into it. As we've said with guests on the show, and I certainly have said too many times to you, to me, I think when we just see amazing posts on social media, the intrinsic, we're desensitized to it. We don't appreciate the amount of hard work and effort and time and money that went into doing that. So to me, I'm often most impressed. I'm more impressed that, oh, you put in the diligence, you found it, and then you put in that diligence and you expressed it then with this, it turned into this beautiful expression, as opposed to just being a 1 in 100 million shot that you just happen to stumble across this. Like, one might be more theoretically amazing. The other is more impressive.
Yeah, for sure. And I agree with that statement, especially regarding the venomous stuff. I mean, I'll give a video a couple seconds, and if I realize that they're free handling, I'm moving on. I'm not giving that another view, or, just drives me nuts to see the frequency of that. And then to see it almost celebrated, in the case of, the guy who got bit by the cobra and was stump brothers with the other guy who got bit by a, Mangshan viper at Crutchfields or whatever. I just, I just like, I don't know, guys, is this the right message to send, And I don't think it is, but I guess, and have I free handled or picked up a venomous snake? Yeah, I have. And, I was as careful as I could be. I'm not, taking unnecessary risks other than picking up the snake. But, one was to make sure you guys got to see a coral snake, and it was a small, and I figured a bite would be very, very unlikely occurrence in that situation. And so I figured the benefits outweighed the risk. And so I made that decision, and, there was no negative consequence to that. But, on the off chance I would have gotten bit, that would have been pretty crappy day for me, I'm sure, or end of my life or something, who knows,
Right. And you weren't, well, I guess the difference is, right, you weren't filming it and doing it strictly to kind of trivialize it or to almost make yourself better than the animal, right? Or raise your credentials relative to the animal, or, at the animal's expense or whatever. So that was about, hey, this is my one shot to get this thing, and taking in that risk calculation seemed like an appropriate thing to do. The contrary situation happened to me, right, with another coral snake, different species, much different size, in Florida on our trip in October. And my risk calculus was like, I'm not going to grab this thing because this could very easily go the opposite way. And again, I wasn't filming it, none of this stuff, none of those factors come into play. But it's like, okay, we're in each interaction, whether you have tools or not, you're engaging in a risk assessment and trying to figure out whether this is a good idea. And it seems like sometimes maybe if the camera's rolling, the risk assessment goes out the window and you just sort of react.
You're trying to get clicks rather than trying to educate or entertain.
Make a good choice for yourself.
Yeah, make a good choice for yourself, for sure.
It's like, how will this look when this video comes out? And rather than being a question of, oh, am I, is this like Phil's venomous etiquette videos? Or is this something that a random person who's not interested in snakes will have this appear on their For You page and be like, whoa, look at this crazy guy doing crazy stuff. That's crazy.
Yep. Yeah. And I want to throw in there too, your kind of ideas on the negativity sometimes that's involved in herping videos. I think that can be a downside. Ready, go. What I'm talking about.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Just again, maybe it comes to my perspective to be about minimizing the animals, where we just say, hey, if oh, it's just another X, and the answer is most of the people who are watching that video, right? Often, whether it's 98%, 95%, what did we come up with that? Facts are figures are persuasive when presented. Non-sourced facts. Feel persuasive 85% of the time, right? Something like that. But so the vast majority, to the point I'm making here, the vast majority of people who are consuming that sort of content, herper bro content, if I can call it that, right, haven't seen and aren't going to see the species. So if people are then trivializing, oh, it's just another X, and I certainly understand that feeling, right? There are things that maybe especially if you're making a video in your local area and you've already seen either that day or over the course of your life, a lot of those animals, it isn't the 1 in 100 species. It isn't the, wow, this is totally amazing, everyone's going to be super impressed that I happen to find this thing that I was probably targeting. Instead, it's just another one of these. Most of the people taking in that content are not situated to see even that, let alone the very special one, right? And I'm sure they would be equally or more so impressed by that very special one just based on the reaction. But I just feel like a lot of those videos do the animals an injustice when they minimize those things. And heck, with our experience in the field, it'll sometimes turn into we just don't take pictures, or we don't take as many pictures, or we don't use the camera, we'll just use a cell phone or whatever. And, that's probably that same thing. It's just we're not filming ourselves doing it. So that, there's not that same message then being presented of like, oh, it's only a this. Anytime you would find yourself saying, oh, it's only a this, I think that's disappointing. And as I highlighted when we had Blaine Mazzetti on, I think he does really well never doing that. Now, I think he's forcing the issue for himself some of those times when he's like, oh, another glossy snake, but he always puts that in the context of, but at least it's a snake. And his whole goal is to go find snakes. So it's not his target. It's not what he's looking for. And he's seen hundreds to thousands of them, but he still says, hey, another snake, that's exciting. First snake of the night, that sort of thing. And I think that positivity is, something I really want to support.
Yeah, I agree. And I think too, those of us who go out herping, you might see one snake in a night. That might be the only snake you see that night. And, get excited about it. I mean, a snake is a snake, they're not commonly encountered by their design, their goal is to not be encountered. And so, yeah, if you see a snake, be excited about it, whether you've seen 50 of their, relatives that day or not. And I'll go back to that story with the leaf nose snakes in California, where I saw so many that it was like, oh, it's just another leaf nose snake. I'm going to not stop and look at it or take pictures or things. But I didn't necessarily appreciate that was kind of a rare event. You don't usually see, 30 snakes in a night, or especially that many leaf nose snakes. And I haven't seen them since. So that's something that if I would have realized in the moment, I might have had enjoyed that a little more. And again, I wasn't filming myself either. So, yeah.
Right. Yeah, totally. But yeah, to realize, I think that is, and that's just human nature, right? Is we don't know what we don't know. And we talked about this even going back to when you were in WA and you found the Woma, right? If you then would come to know, right, that it's always do we keep moving? Snakes are moving, do we keep moving? Do we go on? Or do I really savor this moment? And if you had the hindsight of this is the only thing you're going to see tonight, I'm sure it would have changed, sort of, not change your feeling because it's so exciting, but relative to, what am I going to do here? Am I going to spend an extra 15 minutes just watching it crawl around, that sort of thing? Or, I'm positive the answer to that would be yes. If you knew going into it, this is all it's going to, you can either do this or you're going to be watching Empty Highway, Yep,
exactly. And that's, that's the gamble you take with herping trips. And so again, back to that idea of if you find a snake, enjoy it, because snakes are hard to find. Sometimes certain species more than others, of course. But if you're putting yourself in the habitat where you're going to find those common species, expect to find them and be happy about it, because you're still finding them. They're still abundant. They're still common. That's a good thing, not a bad thing. And I think promotion of that idea I think you make a good point with that needs to be celebrated rather than like, it's just another one of these, or, oh, it's not my target, so I don't really care that much, still get excited.
Yeah, my cynical perspective becomes, if that's how you feel, then you got to expand your field. You got to go looking for other things, go someplace else, or find something better to do with your time. And I know that can sound pretty harsh, but that's genuinely how I feel. It's like, if the only thing, if 9 out of 10 things you find are not gonna, fill your bucket, then go do something better with your time, man.
Right. Yeah. If you've lost the passion, find something else to do. All right. The next episode was a clip show. So in honor of that clip show, we're going to flip the coin just to flip a coin. Go ahead and call it, Rob.
Tails.
It is heads.
So. I can lose again.
Well, you won last time. So I was just trying to see if, that luck was
test it out,
switch your way, or if it's just going to be a back and forth from now on. All right, episode 54 was the idea that field herping makes you a better keeper. So I kind of thought, along the lines of, it definitely helps you understand snakes better, but sometimes it can complicate things and make you think, oh, I need to worry about this and this and this and this, and oh, I can't match. And by the time you've figured or thought about all the possible variabilities, you're like, well, there's no way I can effectively house this animal with all the choices and wonderful things it has in nature. So I'm just going to give up and not keep them. But I don't know. Right. What do you think?
And sometimes the recipe works, right? So kind of that point that you're highlighting, sometimes we can overthink stuff and overcomplicate things that maybe, we're having, as I said, the recipe works, especially with multi-generation captive bred animals, that it's like, okay, this can fit in. There are parameters. We can work within those parameters, make it look more or less naturalistic or whatever. And there are things we can play with that maybe will be informed by not even field herping so much as just education, right? Reading up on the places that they come from. What does that look like? Trying to make even if it's just the picture in the background, I almost think just the visualization of the animal in its enclosure puts it, in my mind at least, into that context. And it almost not only increases my enjoyment at this point of it, but I think it does make you really think about it in the sense of, okay, how would this animal, what is its role within this landscape? How does it fit in? How does its pattern make sense relative to the space? And we just so the Flip and Tin podcast, approaches this idea kind of on their regular cadence when they talk about this. I think it's one of their regular questions that they talk about with people. And the thing that had jumped to my mind, both processing pictures and then thinking of pictures within that, the context of the show, is that it's amazing how often amazing and then amazingly unsurprising, where you just say, wow, this is the least surprising thing ever, that on natural form animals, the coloration and pattern really makes sense within their broader context, where it's like, wow, okay, that is why it looks like that. It almost disappears. And even if we're talking about, banded versus striped animals and this sort of thing, what's the visualization it creates within its ecological niche, right? Is it sitting on rock? Okay, well, maybe the banding makes more sense. Is it in long grass? That striping can give it sort of the visualization as it pulls away. It just sort of recedes from the scene. All these different things. I think that makes a ton of sense. And as I say, maybe that's not even field herping so much as exposing yourself to knowledge about where these things come from. And often our best context for that is, I'm thinking of temperature regimes, back in the olden times when we didn't have great weather station data associated, or even information about where explicitly things were coming from. We would say, oh, well, the weather in Jakarta is this. And it's, well, that has very little bearing on the condition in, the Bird's Head Peninsula of West Papua, right? Yeah. And so, both in terms of what does that environment look like? Obviously, they don't live in Jakarta. And then what are the temperature conditions? All these things. I just kind of drew the parallel there of saying, if we have a sense of where they actually live and what that looks like and what that entails, I really think that does inform it, whether it requires seeing them to appreciate that or not.
Yeah. I mean, within 20 miles, you can have huge variations in temperature and weather and climate, look at, Barfoot compared with, Red Rocks or something. They're or not Red Rocks, but anyway, you know what I mean? Like close by areas in low desert versus a montane area. You got very different things, but very close together. And so, if you take temperature from one, you're going to be messing up your animals from the other. But getting into the environment and helping you feel kind of what they're there. Now, of course, that's a snapshot. And if you're not going back, once a week or once a month for a year, you're probably not getting the full experience. But you can get more experience than you had before you went there. I think that's a very important.
Yeah, absolutely. That's actually super interesting. So it makes me think of, I was the Debbie Downer for Nipper on pyros associated with this, right? So out of the last trip, not the 2023 trip, the mating pyros, right before the two that you found on our 2024 trip. But he was describing that context, and it really changed his expectations or his thought process around this. And I do think there's positivity to that, right? So we're seeing the plus side. The downside that you highlight there is I was going, this has been coming into May of 2023, this has been such a wet year. I promise you, even normal Mays look nothing like this in this area. So it's almost, as you allude to, that it's like your snapshot could be misguided or, sort of misdirected based on, well, that was what it looked like that one time I was there. And we're having conversation on this. And I was like, yes, that's certainly true. But this is absolutely an extreme of what that environment could look like. So just bear that in mind. Absolutely. It's informative, but it's informative of like the very wet end of what that place could look like.
Yeah. So when we found the one on this trip, me and Thomas, we had run into Blake and he made the comment, by this time last year, I'd seen 6 pyros and I haven't seen one yet, this year. So, and that's getting kind of late in pyro season or spring pyro season or whatever, or at least diurnally active pyro season. So definitely the prior year, 2023 was
bumper crop form. And maybe the answer becomes, maybe, I'm the one who's misguided in the sense of saying, if that is the conditions where we're seeing them, and there's sort of this, at least visualization of abundance, maybe that is how we want to keep them, right? Maybe that's the optimal.
Right.
So maybe that's not right. Maybe it's that it highlights the point of maybe our snapshot, it could be a, reference a real extreme outcome. But maybe that actually, in that context, means, yeah, keep them like this because they're doing great. They're feeling great. They're loving it. We're seeing them either more or later than we normally would and all that stuff. So I don't know. As always, cosmic octopus, it's complicated.
Right.
But super interesting.
I did find a really interesting, it's like a historical weather app. So you can go back in time and look at the highs and lows and humidity and, the rain patterns or whatever that day or that week, and you can look at and say, okay, there was a record from this day of this species. And then you can go to that location, look up the weather and for that day and see kind of, okay, are there trends or, and I think as herpers, we want to put ourselves in the environment at the optimal time or the time when we're actually going to see something and not just drive around. I mean, locally, maybe that's not a big deal, but if you're flying halfway across the country or halfway across the world, you want to maximize what you're going to see. You don't want to be there in a less effective time.
At least, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, that's amazing. It's almost, that feels overwhelming almost. It's amazing that this information exists. It's almost overwhelming of saying like, wow, that's just yet another rabbit warren that could be crazy to go down. Yeah.
But I think you can gather that as well on, for example, again, with Thomas, where he's seen 100 pyros, he has a good feel for when he's going to have a good chance of seeing a pyro and when it's probably not worth looking unless, you just want to get out on a hike and enjoy the environment. You're probably not going to see a pyro, so that's,
or it happens to be the date we planned 6 months in advance. And it's like, well, we're looking either way. Yeah.
We're here. We're going to check and see if we can find something. And if we don't, that's okay too. Cause it's a beautiful area anyway. So
absolutely.
Okay. Well, either way, get out and herp. It's an enjoyable experience as long as you're not destroying the, habitat. Don't leave rocks on, put the rocks back if you're looking under them, put the logs back if you're looking under them. Let's keep the wild in good shape so people don't walk through and go, it looks like a bunch of herpers were here. We don't want to be a byword. All right. Next episode, being married to a herper with my lovely wife. I'm sure you've heard from time to time being married and how that may put a strain on your spouse. Any comments there?
Yeah, I think as you highlighted in the show there, did really well. It is, it is a burdensome thing a burden that I'm implying, whether it's captive stuff or going out and all this different stuff. And the answer is I just genuinely express appreciation and admiration because it's not, it's a ton of sacrifice.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate it.
Yeah. And I think that the opportunities that it sometimes provides, for example, I took Heidi with me when we went to Australia. Well, she kind of said, I'm coming with you to keep you safe because I don't trust you off in Western Australia by yourself. So she came to keep an eye on me to make sure I didn't do anything too stupid. But that trip was my flight and everything was paid for by the Scales and Tails folks, Joy Kuligowski and her wonderful sons, and just a great group of people. But they flew me over to give a talk at the Scales and Tails festival. So we kind of tacked on that trip beforehand on our own dime, of course, to go to Western Australia before the Scales and Tails festival. So all in all, we were there almost a month. It was a long trip.
That's amazing.
Fantastic time with Heidi and it was a little rough on her, and it was a learning experience for me because I'm like, well, this is kind of my trip, I shouldn't have to tailor it to you, and that was the wrong attitude for sure. So I think, if you keep that in mind, this could be a really good experience, and how can I make it a good experience for both of us? And and just as an example, I didn't necessarily prepare very well for it because we go road cruising the first night, and then the next night I'm like, all right, let's get ready to road cruise. She's like, we're going again? I'm like, oh, honey, we're doing this every night. It was kind of one of those things. So I could have done better for sure to make it a better experience for her. But I was and again, I've admitted this, I'm pretty selfish when it comes to my time and herping. Like I want to spend every minute I can and not, let anything slow me down. I'll sleep when I'm dead kind of idea. But yeah, so definitely keep your spouse in mind and express gratitude and thanks. I think that's important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anything else on that?
No, I think that's my big picture message. And I think the example you highlight is also very prudent of saying, involvement in a way that makes sense is certainly a good thing, right? That's the same with any interaction.
Yeah. I've got another opportunity in a couple of weeks. We're headed off to Florida to go on a cruise with my family, and we're going to go a few days early to go. And one of the days we're going to spend driving down the Keys because that's what Heidi wants to do. And
awesome.
I'm okay with that, and she's going to go to the Everglades. She wants to go to the Everglades too, but we're going to go on a couple trails that she's a little nervous about. Maybe hopefully see a rattlesnake or two, but we'll see what happens. All right. We definitely appreciate our wives. They're
absolutely. That is an unequivocal message.
Yes, for sure. All right. Number 56. This was, we had Daniel Yates on talking about all things. I don't know if we ever got to the topic or discussed the topic. Is the industry about the keeper or about the animals? And I made the comment, we'll have to rein you in, but I don't think I ever was able to rein him in. He just kind of went off. So some very notable quotes in there and some interesting ideas from Daniel. He sure approaches things from a different point of view, and it was interesting to hear some of his ideas, but definitely was me just kind of, I think you could hear me give up at some point, just like, okay, it's off the rails and it's not getting back on the rails. So we'll just let him get his information out there and his ideas out there. And boy, he did. So. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I always think it's interesting, right? When people have unique perspectives or different perspectives than my own, some of those things, it's like, and this happens a lot when I listen to Reptile podcasts, is I'll say, okay, I'm 85% with you. Again, with the convincing spur of the moment statistics. But when it's, wow, I'm mostly there, or even the opposite. When I'm, okay, I don't understand where you're coming from. I do think it can be helpful in terms of prompting me to think it through and just say, wow, that's approaching this from an angle that I've genuinely never considered. That I need to, make sure that I'm approaching those sorts of things with an open mind and saying, okay, let me critically evaluate. Is this something that, that's been a deficit on my part for not having approached it in that way? My bias puts it so that I've never even considered that. So, I think there's a value to anything that comes out there. And it's, we just all have to have an open and critical mind. And, this certainly, there were definitely things where I was like, okay, I mostly or largely agree. And there were things where it's, wow, I've genuinely never considered it from this perspective. And that's, again, not saying it's wrong. It's making me say, hey, do I need to do that?
Mm-hmm. And I think too, in regards to, I guess, where he was talking about, some of the things that he would do with his bearded dragons. And I think about kind of the beardy mamas out there, and is their experience with their reptiles any less than my experience with my reptiles? They may be more in tune or more concerned about the one versus, my experience. So, I don't think their ideas and views should be discounted, but definitely some ideas can be challenged, and we can definitely do that in a positive and uplifting way rather than, saying these people are crazy or they're doing it wrong or whatever. So, but definitely an interesting episode for sure. All right. The next one, Chuckless again in RFC-ville. So Chuck couldn't come on. So I had my lovely wife fill in again. She was in 2 episodes in these 10. So we kind of talked about a little bit about William Philippek had been on NPR and talking about his sex ratios and things like that. So it was really a cool show and got me thinking about, setting up an experiment to kind of test this, because my experience is the opposite of his. He was having male heavy clutches and I was having female heavy clutches, and thinking about, could incubation temperature have something to do with this? Science, as far as we know, says probably not, but, science is often wrong. And that's the beauty of science, is it changes and evolves as we get new data. And so, I still kind of have that in the back of my mind. I'd like to test this someday, probably when I have a little less hectic schedule and a little more time on my hands. But someday I'll get into designing an experiment and testing that out. But so that was kind of the main things we talked about there. I don't know, any thoughts on your end?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you highlight really well that, just the open-mindedness to data, right, to accurate data. And then we just need to not be married to particular ideas, right? We just have to take that in and try and honestly assess, where does this take us? In terms of my own experience with pythons, I haven't seen that. And that sort of maybe aligns with the experience that you've seen. That being said, we do know that it occurs in some species of reptiles, and I've seen it in species of Asian rat snakes in my lived experience. So, I guess maybe I can kind of relate to them in this context, although, again, probably the number of data points on that are more limited, and my share of the data points is probably certainly higher than any one of us with pythons, right? So maybe I can be more confident in that, but that doesn't mean it's persuasive to other people, and certainly it hasn't been critically evaluated. There was one particular animal that I thought I did actually, referencing Ben again, I did get it genetically tested to say, okay, if theoretically it was a snake that visually appeared to be female, was probed a median depth, deeper than a normal female, not shallower than a normal male. And the question was going to be, and I think ultimately, unfortunately, with the animal, I think the animal wound up passing away. So I got a shed sample, but I think then it wasn't sufficient to drive a result. So as far as I remember, we didn't get a conclusive result that would have validated it, but the question was going to be how that was going to interact with the test that Ben does, right? Effectively, that if the real presuming, as we do, that the markers that he's identified, right? If we have a valid data sample, if in those things we could have something that genetically tested as a male and produced eggs, then we could say, okay, well, here's pretty solid evidence for we have a genetic male that has produced eggs. Well, it obviously has female structures, and not only structures, but sufficient to actually produce an egg, let alone fertile offspring or whatever. That would be the sort of thing that would suggest, okay, absent there being a problem on the testing side, that maybe we have a genetic sex that's being overridden by incubation temperature. Again, which we do see in reptiles. I don't know that it's proven in any snakes. Again, I think it happens in Oreocryptophis porphyracea and in Rhechophis. In my lived experience, incubation temperature seems to result in higher ratios of one sex or the other over, decently significant sample sizes. But I think that would be the only serpent where we know where that would be true, which would, to my mind, then suggest it probably happens more broadly. We just aren't aware of it, rather than saying, oh, it just so happens to only occur in these. There might be something about snakes of that area. I don't know. Mm-hmm. But certainly we know what happens in other squamates.
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, I think about the fish example with those, what are they, the big forehead fishes?
Are the ones that can change, right? They change throughout the course of their life. Truly wild, right?
Or if there's not a male present, they can fill in that gap with a female. Absolutely. And they become a male, a functional male. So it's incredible.
I think, just the wildness. We are aware, we know of some of this stuff that's just so wild that to me it would be closed-minded to unequivocally, like sort of that opposite point of saying like, no, this can't be true. We don't, the absence of evidence or whatever. Well, some of the evidence we have, not in this lineage or whatever, but we know that wild stuff happens that you wouldn't imagine. So I guess that puts me to be more open-minded to those things, though it doesn't make me any less, doesn't make me require evidence to substantiate that any less. It's just saying I won't dismiss it out of hand.
Yeah. Oh, it's exciting to think about all the discoveries that are out there waiting for somebody to, test them thoroughly and figure these things out. It's pretty cool. But I don't know, science is exciting in that way.
But the importance of methods, right? The ability, the practicability of any of this, all this stuff, it's not just saying, oh, well, the fish example you highlight, oh, that must mean that, my one observation of this one thing makes it true. It's just saying, okay, well, maybe what's your data? Make your argument. Let's see if we can validate or disprove based on a larger sample.
Yeah, I think the reason it kind of caught my attention is because Will was kind of saying, oh, maybe that's the way it is in the species, that they're just male heavy because they're small pythons and they get eaten real fast or whatever, and maybe they need more males. And so, if without my observation of female heavy clutches, he might be led down that avenue of that assumption, and maybe there is, it doesn't have anything to do with that, or it's genetics or whatever. I just have a pair that produces females in larger abundance or whatever, or
right.
That's the roll of the dice.
Which might also be true, right?
Yeah,
I mean, that wouldn't, again, I'm not saying that it is, but that's the sort of thing that someone not open-minded to this topic might say, unequivocally, no, I've never heard of anything like that, so I'm going to totally dismiss that as even being possible, as opposed to saying, well, let's evaluate the evidence, right?
Yeah. That's the better attitude to have. And I think too, for all the negative consequences of morphs on the hobby, we've discovered some pretty cool reptile related, breeding, genetic, inheritance modes, whatever, through morphs. And we couldn't have done these studies without morphs, twins and things that have different mutations, within the set of twins is kind of a cool thing, and can kind of lead us to identify different traits or different modes of inheritance. And I think one of the most interesting one was the banana ball python with the sex-linked trait. Was pretty crazy.
And do you remember for how many years people just thought Kevin's just lying? He's, and that was the default response. And maybe this is what I push back on, is that sort of mentality of that was so distinct from people's lived experience that they just assumed, okay, this has to be a marketing play. You just have to be lying. And then in fact, once there was then the opposite gender produced, that's all it would make, just totally wild. Totally wild.
Yeah. And then when more data becomes available and everybody's having a similar experience, it just, kind of says, maybe he's onto something.
Yeah. Maybe people need to go back and retroactively apologize for calling him a liar for all that time.
I would love to see that happen in the reptile industry.
Yeah, that doesn't happen very much.
Times that happens. Yeah. All right. Next one was, this was a fun one. Talking about different temperature regimens with Lisa Farina. I really like Lisa. She's got some really great insights into reptiles in general, and is really attentive to her animals and makes really cool observations. So it was nice to have her on. We were talking about varied temps versus stable temperature regimens. But yeah, it was great. We need to have her back on, get some more good Lisa info out there. But she's very successful too in her keeping. She's produced some traditionally difficult to produce species, and is just really a really great keeper.
Yeah, absolutely, totally agree. Love the positivity. Love kind of fresh mindset and approach. It's really fantastic, and I agree with you. Hopefully, we got to come up with an excellent topic to have her come on and chat through. For sure. So I don't know, what's your thoughts on varied versus kind of more stable temps? Kind of the constraints of my room forced me to be a believer in variable temperatures and sort of the seasonality across all things. And I think fortunately at this point, the stuff that I have really aligns with that and situates well with it. So, that kind of highlights the topic of keeping things that do well in your conditions, right? And how that can make your life easier. Or you have to, the incentive becomes to dramatically change and modify your conditions if you're going to keep something that wouldn't naturally suit. So, for me, I think also there's a little bit of and this has been highlighted, from even going back as far as, when Terry had come on, I was talking through, and that the conditions at Reptile Gardens are more, it's always, or even at Terry's house, right? It's presented as, well, this is the goal. And some of those, even between those two places, there's one is more fixed than the other. Even if the ideation is, hey, this is what we're trying to do, there's more inputs or outflows that are required to try and make that happen, and to greater or lesser success, right? So I do think there's certainly something to that. I'm not discounting that approach, but I pretty much embrace the natural flow and just try and make sure I'm keeping guardrails on what's happening.
Yeah. And I mean, some species have evolved in areas that are pretty stable in their temperatures. They're not fluctuating wildly. You pretty much have 70 degree, with a 5 degree variance up and down throughout the whole year, and you're living on the equator. And then others, you're having a 30-day fluctuation from day to night. It's so, definitely dependent on the species and what your goals are. If you're trying to keep, like Terry, 50 different species alive in the same room, then you're looking for those commonalities or a similar temperature that keeps everybody happy. Or, if you're trying to breed a colubrid or, a temperate colubrid, you're going to need to cool it down, or you're probably not going to have repeated success with that project, because they're just adapted and evolved to do well in that environment.
At the same time, they might live, right? And certainly at the gardens, right? That's the goal. So it's like, okay, what's the driver of, what's the driving goal? Is it production, or is it to have a beautiful living collection? Right?
Exactly. And as always, it goes back to understanding the natural history of the species you keep, knowing where they come from, what they utilize different temperatures for. If it's for males to produce good sperm, they need a cooling period. So if you don't provide that cooling period, you're probably not going to have great offspring from that male. So, understanding things like that is probably very important to your successful keeping. So, I guess. And
aligning your inputs, right? So that okay, if hey, the room experiences volatility, I don't want to be feeding heavily as I'm going into a cooler, right? As I know the room's going to drop down. That's probably not I need to have alignment amongst my various inputs.
Yeah. And I mean, also, to some extent, reptiles are not coming out at all hours of the day. They're choosing their preferred temperatures. And I think that's kind of what Terry was hitting on with his finding that, zone of success for as many species as possible, is that most species are only active when it's kind of in that range. And so, that makes sense to shoot for that in your captive environment. But, that's a snapshot of part of the year, maybe not the entire year.
Well, and we talk about it too, that are we seeing base level dehydration in animals that never get too hot? Right. So if their basking temperature is never too hot, they bask constantly, and it creates this underlying dehydration. Right. So as ever, so many different competing factors to consider. It
definitely gets very, very difficult and very complex, and that's the beauty of nature, is it's not a simple, give them 80 degrees, they're good to go,
Absolutely.
Unless you're trying to keep everybody happy and alive, then give them 80 degrees and they're good to go.
And then just be responsive to the data set that you're getting. If, that's working, then that's data, right? If it's not working, that's data as well. Just be responsive.
Right. And I really like those studies like Rick Shine did with the diamond pythons, where he followed them at different times of the year and said kind of what environments they were in and what methods they were using to thermoregulate, because thermoregulation is the key with most reptiles, and especially for a temperate weather python, it's going to be very important to their success. So if you understand that, you're going to do pretty well. So, yeah. Any other ideas on that topic?
Too many. Well, and I just love honestly, my sort of driving paradigm is a recognition that the complexity of nature exceeds our human capacity to understand it. So I just always try and approach it with that perspective. At the same time, I recognize the limitations within our little boxes. So
yeah, for sure. And that's a huge part of it is, we have limited space, and it's very difficult to give them a 30-degree swing in that limited space because we don't know how they're buffering themselves against those thermal swings and things like that. So, yeah. All right. Next topic was, I think this topic was as in a little bit of a poke at Chuck. This is Dominique Carbonneau. I think that's how I'm bad.
Sounds right.
Afraid. Sorry, Don. But breeding to everything with a cloaca, because Chuck loved that phrase so much.
That muttonism.
Yeah, exactly. The muttonism. So I think, just the idea of if you have something that like a morph, and you want to get that morph out there, just breed it to everything in your collection. Every female you can get it to, regardless of if it's the same subspecies or species, or, just get that morph into those animals. And that's kind of the idea of that in the long run, I think, was that happened as a result of the morph craze. And so that was a consequence that down the road we had a bunch of mixed, blood carpet pythons. That was kind of the
right. Even if it wasn't clear at the time, right? So if you're talking about coastal carpets, right? Jags, that's amenable to all, anything that I have that's labeled a coastal, right? Regardless of how they look, to the extent that we have information about where they're from, all this different stuff. And yeah, I think even the coiner of the phrase, right, is kind of in a spot relative to that, in the sense of saying, okay, well, it's a good thing that he's also really done a good job of keeping projects within projects, as well as, in that instance, he was crossing those projects, and now, what does he do relative to that? I don't think he was really taking Brisbane's to Jags. He really appreciates this. He's a splitter, as much of a splitter as anyone I know, and certainly he, I think, could appreciate that those are not the same thing, and those being so distinctly different. But at the same time, within the mutations and things, the exanthic, well, where does that fit? Although those are both probably northern animals. So I guess, it's really the uncertainty is probably where it becomes more of a question, out of the striped stuff and all that, the old lineage striped stuff.
Yep. And this goes into, ideas with like green tree pythons and, localities and locality gray bands, and how particular do you want to get, or is it just all snakes in boxes? So who cares? Just make a pretty looking snake. I guess everybody has different goals and different ideas of what they want to keep. And that's a healthy thing. And I think to argue that one is better than the other is probably where the fault lies, to say being a purist is more important than being a morph guy or whatever is, I think there's place and value for both. And I'll still go back to one of my favorite carpet that I've ever seen was like a 5 or 6 way cross, and it had like inland and coastal and diamond and jag and jungle and all in, one snake. And it was a gorgeous animal. It was a really nice looking snake. And it made me think, do I want to start, breeding? But I mean, it was one in 100 probably snake. And so I don't know, there's definitely different avenues for people. And I mean, we were kind of discussing on the boards recently about hybrids and why are people making these hybrids? And again, I mean, who really cares in the long run, unless they're jeopardizing some, our access to localities, pure snakes or something like that. If they, even that, it's their decision, and why shouldn't they be able to produce those hybrids? But
yeah, I mean, I guess the thing that always jumps to my mind, right, is we just have, when we do that, we need to recognize that it can't be undone. There's no amount of breeding back that will ever say, not maybe maybe that matters to you, or maybe it doesn't, but that's incontrovertibly true, right? There's no once it's been done, there's no undoing it. And we've seen it with variable king snakes, the Lamprepeltis leonis, that it was a big thing to sort of either based on information, either intentionally or unintentionally, based on limited information, right? I don't want to commit the sin of utilizing 25, 30 years of retroactive knowledge and applying to 40 years even of retroactive knowledge and applying it to that context. But we do know now that in the 80s, people were breeding tricolored snakes amongst one another. And it does make a random, what's labeled as a variable king snake today, since those are animals with few exceptions, right? There are not lineaged animals going back to before Mexico closed to the legal or illegal or whatever to the origin of those animals in captivity. There are only a handful of lines that are sort of known with surety. And if you just arbitrarily have someone presents a variable king snake, even if it looks like being a variable king snake, they have a variety of presentations, but sort of any weirdness at all, the instant reaction is, well, I have no confidence that animal is a Lamprepeltis leonis. It might be a hobby leonis, and that's basically the label that you would put on it. But in terms of certainly for someone who would bring the level of who wants the level of confidence that Nick or Vin Russo has about the animals that they're working with, for it to be fun for them, a lot of the variable king snakes that are available for sale, you wouldn't be able to have that level of surety around because that's what was happening. And so I do think when someone's doing it in the moment, it becomes, well, I'm honestly representing it. You honestly representing it has nothing to do with its descendants 30 years later. It doesn't.
Right.
Certainly if you intentionally mislabel what happened now, that's only going to make that more likely to happen. But you could be as honest and transparent about this as you want. We know that barely holds up, on a resale of that same snake, let alone 30 years down the line, what's happening, especially if it's something that isn't so visually, it doesn't make an offspring that sort of sends up yellow flags around these.
Yeah. Right. And I think too, like this goes back to when I was writing the first edition of the carpet book with back in 2010, our idea of what made a certain carpet python was based on our limited experience with U.S. lineages and maybe a few pictures in like the Barker's book or something. We were focused on what we had in our hands and what was in front of our face. So if something fell out of that and really going to Australia and finding some of these snakes in the wild made me think, wait a second, this looks nothing like what I would expect a coastal from this area to look like. Looks completely different than I had in my mind was the box that we drew around coastal carpet, and just seeing the variability. And then with the advent of, some of these photo hosting sites where you can look at Australian herpers pictures where they're taking pictures of a range of different carpet pythons from the same area. And there's a huge variability. And we're like, okay, we don't know what we're talking about. We're talking, based on a very limited experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly that more than anything just discourages to, engage in arguments based on that limited amount of information. Right. So I've seen Brisbane carpets that look like the textbook Brisbane carpets, right? And those that do not.
Yeah.
Our first gelatin carpet looked like a citrus tiger. Yeah. The second one looked like what we have in the hobby here is gelatin carpets, textbook. But I think, so certainly I wouldn't go in, we see it. I think the worst offenders are the diamond python people in the United States, right? In terms of saying, you who live in Australia within that range, don't, my knowledge trumps yours, or that, whatever. That's obviously absurd. Yeah. That's sort of the absurdist extreme on this. Yeah. Yet on the other hand, right, that doesn't mean citrus tigers are from gelatin. Mm-hmm. Just because that phenotype can come from there, there's, in the absence of evidence to that, to substantiate that, that doesn't mean, right? We've seen that with the opposite plenty of times, right? Where I think even the Cape York spotted pythons, right? Those I forget who it was giving this context, but it was like, oh yeah, I was there when those original animals had come in and person X sold them to the Barkers and they didn't have the label and they said, well, that's what they look like, so that's what they are, or whatever. And that's not to say that that's wrong, but like that happens. That's a specific example of something that has happened a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, going off of phenotype is always kind of a dangerous avenue to take, to say with certainty, this phenotype means it's this, especially with carpet pythons or Australian pythons in general. I mean, that's very difficult to say. And there's just so much variability. That's, and, you know, I think that's, again, you know, with our 30 years or 20 years hence, more evidence and more knowledge, we can think, oh, that was laughable back then. But man, there were some pretty heated and highly argumentative debates back in the day about purity and lineage and what is a certain carpet python, whether it was pure or whether it was mixed or whatever. It was pretty funny to think about now, but pretty serious to a lot of people back then. Yeah, but I don't know. I think, you know, and I you know, one example of my experience, I bought a pair of Cape York spotted pythons and then hatched out some granites. And I'm like, well, they're not pure if they're hatching out granites as far as I know. So I got rid of those, you know, and it's just kind of what's your goals and what you want to keep. I did keep a couple of the granites because they were cool looking, but but I'll sell those as granites, not as Cape York spotted. So, but I mean, they did have the look of Cape York spotted. So to say the look is everything, you know, that's not the case. Who got fooled with the car plots and some of those hybrids, you know, that look just like funky carpet pythons, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of things that happen like that. All right. Well, the last topic and the final topic of our clip show today was episode 60, talking about how have animal rights issues shape the hobby in a good way or a bad way. And I mean, of course, there's ideas on both sides, and you know, what to that topic as well. What do you think? What do you think?
Yeah, as I remember listening to this one, a couple of years ago now, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's really tough, right? And so I do think, to the extent that anytime people are cognizant of the impression that their actions create, that's probably a positive thing, right? Not in terms of a fear response, but just like an acknowledgement of, hey, how I'm doing things does matter. I think there's value to that. At the same time, there are things that might give a certain impression, but with knowledge and experience might not be quite as negative or derogatory, or appears, it looks like this, but actually that situates well with the animal's natural history or whatever it might be, right? So that it actually makes sense. And that's always a difficult balance to strike. And I think basically the line that I would choose to take on that is just saying, if you're being solely driven by your sentimental bias one way or another, you're probably not sufficiently impartial. Your judgment is clouded on either end. Yeah. And I think that's probably, I guess, what I would have to say about that.
Yeah. And I mean, I think, the fact that there are very few puppy mills, or at least, they're under, they're not gonna provide pictures and things like that. The idea that that's decreasing and people are looking for well cared for animals and things like that, versus just like, I don't care. Just give me, I just want that type of dog. I don't care where it comes from. They want to know the parents and the lineage and see pictures and where they were raised and their first breath and their first meal. And you do see a little bit of that coming into the reptile hobby, which is not the worst thing in the world. Now, of anyone that produces more than a couple clutches a year, you're not going to have that information necessarily unless you're very detail oriented and have a lot of time, or, and I think that's where maybe some of these professional breeders can have an advantage of having all this information, knowing the animals well. But I mean, obviously somebody who produces an animal is going to have a lot more insight into how it's doing and what it's acting like or whatever, because they hatched it and they've had it its whole life, rather than somebody who's just bought a clutch of animals from a breeder and is trying to flip them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, simultaneously, right? Maybe if it's a flipper whose whole goal is to bring those animals from a difficult stage, a non-feeding in a species where that is a non-zero challenge, and bring them to be like a really super marketable, excellent looking animal. Or maybe it's a context of a captive hatched, a young wild caught or a captive hatched animal. Pro Exotics did this for years with a whole host of different species, right? Of saying, yeah, we're going to go hand select these animals and we're going to work with them and maximize their attractability, their presentation, make sure they're well adjusted, all this different stuff. I do think there's value to that. So, again, the whole the point of import is honesty relative to that, and presumably the relative value that's being put in and provided and how people are taking it is going to be reflected in the price point for which something's offered and the price point then the buyer is going to be willing to pay. So there just needs to be an alignment between those two things, right? Saying that, one captive hatched blood python is not the same. They're not all the same. They're not indistinguishable. There's a whole host of different factors relative to, a prospective keeper's ultimate enjoyment of that animal that are going to be deserve a different price point, right? Based on the work that goes into them, the natural, the inherent factors in terms of their pattern, color, their inclination to feed, how that's promoted, their attractability relative to how they've been manipulated, all these different things. Like they're not all equivalent. And usually there's price is the principal distinguisher there. And sometimes it's just information. Other times it's genuinely like this is a small, Reptile Mountain is a local breeder of blue tongue skinks who, I think he has a phrase that I was trying to, boutique reptile breeder, something like, I'm trying to think of the exact terminology, but, and he did a really excellent, he has a YouTube channel, but he has, kind of a nice term for that it's like, okay, that is one experience as opposed to purchasing from, a wholesale outfit. Obviously the price point is going to be different. And I do think there's a justification of that.
Yeah, definitely. That's the movement towards larger caging and more, naturalistic keeping. I think it's kind of a double-edged sword, but it's definitely got its pros and cons, and is moving in a good direction. And, of course, when they, like you said, when they take things out of context or things don't match up with reality, like they're saying, oh, you have to put a water dish in every reptile's enclosure. Some reptiles just don't drink from a water dish, and you could have a water dish right in front of them and they're going to dehydrate and die because they're not getting the water in the way that they are evolved or adapted to get that water. So, yeah, sorry, I was trying to, TC Houston, the Reptile Mountain guy. Yeah. I like his stuff. He's a good dude. And seems to do a really good job. He's former professional AZA zookeeper focusing on conservation, propagation, welfare, and ethics. So I think he does a pretty good job of doing that in a positive manner rather than trying to beat people down, showing people how it can be done. So yeah, one of those good examples out there. Well, any other thoughts on that topic, or have we?
No, beyond saying, hey, maybe it'd be fun to have TC on.
Yeah,
he's a
for
super
sure.
interesting guy.
Definitely.
With a lot of cool ideas. So maybe that's another one as we're
Another one to
ideating
write
here
down.
in the podcast. Yeah,
For sure. TC, if you're out there, think of a good topic and we'll contact you or something.
absolutely.
Nice. All right. Well, another clip show in the books. Any other topics you want to hit on? Any cool things that you've seen in herpetoculture or in general?
Yeah. So I got some new books, but for today, we had talked about this last week or the week before associated with a different off-air conversation.
Uh-huh.
But Craig Trumbauer had, when I was talking to him about West Texas locales to go to, he said, well, you're familiar with the Right and Right Handbook of Snakes of the United States and Canada. And I said, I'm not. Please explain. Please elaborate. And it winds up being a book first published in 1957. Oh, wow. A lot of subsequent reprints. Mine is from fifth printing, 1975, but it's a 2-volume set available from used booksellers for, $20, $25, $30, something like that. It's just totally amazing. So there's a level of depth and detail and information, including like exact field notes associated with particular specimens that Clobber collected in the 1930s, details associated with different, the first, it really goes into detail around the leaf nose snakes, right? The spotted leaf nose, and the whole detail of, one time they thought they were common, and sort of the transition point from, they were thought to be uncommon and certainly uncommonly found, to then sort of the Knights of Abundance, like you highlighted earlier, So I would wholeheartedly suggest those, right? So I'm almost 65 or 70 years late to the party, but, new to me, and certainly something what's got me excited. That's got me excited.
Cool. Yeah. It's I don't know. You kind of got me into that a couple of years ago with the Clobber books, and, rethinking and, thinking about it. I had read, and just loved his, handbook of snake, or keeping the keeper and the kept.
The Caulfield one. Yeah.
Caulfield. What did I say?
Well, you said Clobber, which is, I had said Clobber, which is also, fits in the same box, but very different presentation. But,
yeah. No, the Caulfield book. Sorry. Yeah. The Keeper and the Kept. And that was one that I'd read as a kid and just devoured and thought it was the coolest thing. And then reading, what's the other book? Snakes and Snake Hunting. And I mean, obviously there were some outdated methods included in that.
Vernacular, like all this different stuff. But to me,
it's very valuable.
The magic of it, as much. Yeah, certainly there are valuable tips and sort of promotes ideation. And then there's also just a beauty to it.
And kind of that romantic, thoughts of exploring untamed or unknown wilderness and finding species that are, new to most people and, potentially new to
finding
science.
the same things in those same spots, which happens way more in sort of the relative to the Arizona stuff that's detailed in the book than it does with the
New Jersey.
Our New Jersey experience has been pretty grim, but we've herped those same spots and even talking about specific references to the like highly specific locations that it was this was a disused building that he's describing from 20 years before 25 years being disused 25 years before the publication of his book that we're reading 65 70 years later, but we've been to those same buildings and there are still remnants of those structures there, and there is a magic to that.
It's very cool. And just reading it and saying, I've been there and I've seen that same snake in that same position on a rock or, whatever it might be. But pretty cool to think about. And I mean, another motivation to get out there and find stuff. And I mean, when he talks about the Pine Barrens, he talks about the difficulty of finding things and how it took him to find a corn snake and, things like that. So it's
absolutely.
It's
good perspective.
Yeah,
good
it's real. It's fun read for sure. So some of these old books are still have a lot of value, even though they're maybe a little bit outdated. But and it looks like you can find those Handbook of Snakes of the United States and Canada online, like Rob said, on some of the used book dealers. But cool, I'll have to check those out as well.
How about you?
Just trying to get over this cold, but I don't know. I'm still riding high after our herp trip. That was a lot of fun, and a lot of now I'm itching to get out again. I guess be a couple months, and
Florida will be good for you, right?
Yeah, hopefully it'll be. And again, I'm not gonna push Heidi too hard, and we'll try to get to a couple trails. But if she's not comfortable, we'll probably take off and try for another day. But I'm excited to get back to the Everglades. It's been a decade or so since I've been there, so it'll be interesting to see. So
I haven't been, so there you go.
Okay,
another
all right,
experience I've yet to have. But
Aspen gave me some really nice, helpful hints, and so thanks to Aspen. He's such a good guy. But I'm excited to check out Florida, and then get out into the Bahamas and see some cool fish or whatnot, and try the flow rider on the cruise ship. See if I can beat myself up good trying to surf on the flow rider. But all right, well, I think that's a good spot to end on, and we'll thank Eric and Owen and the NPR crew for hosting the show, and we'll catch you again next week for another episode of Reptile Fight Club. Thanks for listening. Fight Club.